When I hear pirate's sword, I always think of the cutlass. In particular, this picture of Francois Lalonnais, one of the most terrifying filibusters. He's seen here against the backdrop of sinking ships, drowning castaways, and a burning settlement. One can imagine the blood-curdling screams of women and children, gunfire, and the hacking of blades. This illustration was made in 1684 to accompany a book about his exploits. It illustrates what tight bedfellows Blade and Buccaneer were. And unlike many of these illustrations, the cutlass does look quite authentic. The biggest advantage of the cutlass lay in its length. Size did matter, but in this case, shorter ones were favored. It's often underestimated how uncomfortable a ship of the period was. There wasn't a whole lot of space to move around in, and a longer sword could easily get stuck on rogue rigging or bits of wood, both in combat and the everyday. So the cutlass design was largely utilitarian. It bore some other design choices which distinguished it from other swords, both in its blade and hilt. Other swords will be discussed later on, but since the cutlass was the most popular one at sea, it's good to use as a reference point. To compensate for the short length, the cutlass blade was noticeably thicker than other contemporary swords. This added weight gave it more inherent damage. It was regarded as an easy weapon which you could really give to any untrained sailor and expect them to make decent use of, especially when fighting in tight formations and confined spaces, which was the norm aboard wooden ships. Boarding combat was madness. And the damage potential of the cutlass was terrifying. There were rumors that you could cleave a man in two, which may not be true, but does attest to its power. Even when dull, the blade was heavy enough to break bones. It was akin to getting hit with a steel rod. The cutlass blade was single-edged, meaning that only the front, the edge, was sharpened, the back flat, called a spine. Double-edged swords were sharp on both sides. Think the medieval longsword. It's often been debated what the qualities of either are. Single-edged blades appear to have required less training and maintenance, but dulled more quickly, and were thus unfit for prolonged combat. So again, it plays into the cutlass' purpose. It should also be noted that the lower edge of the cutlass, close to the hilt, wasn't sharpened. It was surely a common tactic to grab hold of this part to defend yourself, and in one incident, a sailor of extraordinary strength was even able to break it off. The spine of the blade might be engraved with marks of origin. French cutlasses made in the 18th and 19th centuries were often made at Klingenthal, so the spines are engraved with Manufacture de Klingenthal. The cutlass wielded by Francois Lalonnais is distinguishably curved. Curved blades allowed for more powerful cleaving cuts, but the deeper it curved, the harder it became to thrust, and since the cutlass was meant to be flexible, it had to strike a balance between cleaving and thrusting. Some cutlasses were completely straight, but none of them appear to have been as curved as sabers or scimitars, which were cavalry weapons. Thrusting was also facilitated by giving the blade a clip point, that is, diagonally cutting off the back half of the tip. It's very similar to this example. Though the blade is curved, the point is almost perfectly aligned with the grip of the sword, making it excellent for thrusting. Not every blade had this feature. The blade could range between 17 inches or 43 centimeters to 27 inches 68 centimeters. A lot of them appear to have one or more fullers, which are grooves cut into the blade. Contrary to common belief, it was never done to channel blood. It was a manufacturing process to widen the blade. If the blade wasn't wiped, however, the blood could oxidize into a grim sort of trophy, though this would accelerate rusting. A more common form of decoration were markings of origin. These could range from kings in profile to fleurs-de-lis. Blades from the German town of Solingen were often marked with the sun. A lot of swords during this period had at least their blades made in Solingen, and such examples have allegedly been found as far as India and Japan. Back to markings, the cutlass shouldn't be seen as some work of art. Most of them were rugged weapons, easily assembled from just a few pieces in large quantities. Steel was the only material fit for blades, but the metal does seem to have varied in the hilt. The debate was largely between brass and iron. Brass hilts were very often highly decorated, and it's also a pretty material in and of itself. Paradoxically, brass was relatively inexpensive. A fancy hilt costed as much to produce as a plain one after the mold was cut, whereas iron hilts demanded considerable time to forge and assemble. The existence of brass hilts was a threat to ironworkers, and their manufacture was outlawed between 1563 and 1683. While brass hilts were certainly pretty, they were soft and fractured more easily, which limited their functional design. Brass handles had to be thicker and more concentrated, whereas iron could be used more creatively, and might have been superior. The basis of any hilt was the grip. Indeed, many swords historically did only have a grip. They were usually made from antler, bone, wood, or metals like the ones aforementioned. Antler sounds very fancy, but appears to have been just as accessible to regular privateers. In the wreck of the Dauphine, 3 antler grips were found in the fore, indicating that they were owned by ordinary crewmen. This is compared to the iron-hilted swords found in the rear of the ship, where the officers resided. Fancier grips might be made from ivory. The grip could also be given an uneven surface, making it less likely to slip from sweat and blood. Antler handles often had a shaved surface. Brass grips could be twisted, and wooden ones wrapped in wire made from iron, copper, or even gold and silver. Grips were also covered in leather or rawhide, especially shagreen, the hides from shark and ray. The second most important part is the pommel, a knob at the end of the grip. It acts as a rest for your hand, and a counterweight for the sake of balance, very much a necessity for a heavy blade like the cutlass. Some pommels were part of the grip itself, simply a curved bit at the end. Brass pommels were usually part of the brass grip itself, and though easy to manufacture in one piece, could be very fanciful. They often came in the shapes of lions, dogs, dolphins, and monsters, with the guard protruding from their jaws. Blackbeard was portrayed with such a pommel. Pommels were often metal knobs made from brass, but usually iron, screwed onto the grip. It was typically just a plain sphere, sometimes ribbed, with a little knob at the end. It could be used as a weapon in and of itself. Slam it at close range into your opponent's face. The technique is called pommeling. I wonder why. Quillons, or crossguards, are metal bars placed horizontally between the blade and the grip, whose purpose is to keep your hand from slipping onto the blade, which could be pretty bad. These varied in length, but were often curved, usually for the sake of aesthetics, but some quillons were so curved as to serve as a knuckle guard. And the purpose of that piece should be obvious. It guards your knuckle from incoming blows. It wasn't an uncommon tactic to strike at your opponent's hand to disarm them. They could also be used as a duster to punch someone's teeth in. As seen previously, brass guards were often forged in one piece with the quillon, or the pommel and grip. Due to the brittle consistency of brass, they had to be thicker and more concentrated, as not to shatter upon impact. This is really where iron was the superior material. Olonay wields a cutlass with an iron shell, whose purpose is to protect the back of his hand, something which brass handles are unable to do as effectively. You could cast a sort of protective cage around it. These iron shells are very iconic to the period, and were very often scalloped to look like seashells, but some were plain. Iron hilts often had the quillons and shell forged into a single piece, together with a thumb ring. Again, its purpose lies in the name. You stick your thumb in it, which stabilizes the heavy weapon and prevents it from shifting during a cut. The illustration gives an excellent insight into the type of sword favored by pirates. All of its design features were tailored to its purpose. A short, heavy blade that looks scary, can do some serious damage from cutting, hacking, thrusting, and punching, without the need for intensive training, can be used in close confinements of a ship, and worn comfortably on the average day when climbing and moving about. It is a rugged design, but its sheer utility was attested to by corsair and master swordsman René du Guesclin. He described himself as using a small sword for fighting duels ashore, but when going to sea, he always wielded a cutlass. To be precise, René called his cutlass a saber. The weapon did not have a single name, because the 1600s loves to confuse you by using 5 million different names for everything. What we'd call a cutlass could be called a saber, scimitar, curtle axe, machete, falchion, and hanger. Let's try to make sense of these words. Saber was a general term for curved backswords. It could refer to the cutlass, but it could also refer to the longer and more deeply curved cavalry sword, only fit for swinging from horseback. To clarify, this is a saber and a cutlass. This is a saber, but not a cutlass. Saber, as a synonym for cutlass, was sometimes used in English, but primarily by the French. On rare occasion, the French used coutelan, believed by many to be the origin of the English word curtle axe, which became cutlass. It derives from the Latin cultellus, meaning a short sword. Machete described first and foremost a tool, a heavy blade used for hacking sugarcane and vegetation. It seems as if the Boucanier used the machete in this regard, as a survivalist tool. Machete blades varied in design, some having a flat point and others appearing like a shorter cutlass blade, others being long and thin, but what really distinguished them was their lack of a hilt, which ultimately made them a poor weapon of choice. Anne Bonny and Mary Read were described as wielding machetes, but it's uncertain if the landlubber witness was unable to distinguish the machete from its cousins. Falchion was a medieval sword considered the progenitor of the cutlass. The name does appear in the 17th century, and the type of cutlass blade that was tall, broad, and slightly curved was called a falchion blade. Lastly, there's the issue of the hanger. It could refer to any short cut and thrust fighting sword, and the cutlass was considered a type of hanger. Its technical name would be naval hanger, and though usually called cutlass in the common tongue, the Royal Navy only ever recognized it as a hanger, and it becomes necessary to call the naval hanger a cutlass to distinguish it from other hangers. For example, there were ceremonial hangers. The sword has long been recognized as a symbol of status and violence, and was often worn on special occasions or even as a fashion statement. Ceremonial hangers were lighter and unfit for combat. And then there was the hunting hanger. It could either be considered a short sword or a long knife. Gentlemen would wear them during hunting trips, and also brought them to sea. And of course they were military hangers. Whatever you called the cutlass, it was pretty much always distinguished from other swords. Period records make a distinction between cutlasses and swords, or hangers and swords, sabers and swords, etc. Sometimes they are called long swords or straight swords. This could have referred to the tuck, also called a stock. It's a double-edged sword with a fairly long and thin blade. One pirate crew was described as being armed with them, so they might have been somewhat commonplace. But in a lot of cases, these straight swords were probably small swords, the most common infantry blade of its day. In the 1630s, the French developed a new fencing style relying on speed, precision, and subtle wrist movements, requiring a sword that was lighter and shorter than the traditional rapier. Enter the small sword. It's essentially a short rapier, the rapier being a very long and thin sword, which will be covered in the next chapter. As the century progressed, the small sword blade became thinner, turning it purely into a weapon for thrusting. Compared to the cutlass, it required extensive training to use effectively, but when mastered, certainly became much deadlier. It was the favorite weapon for gentlemen, both as a fashion statement and for settling affairs of honor. The hilt of the small sword was largely similar to the hanger. It mostly consisted of a wire-bound grip with a round pommel, a knuckle bow merged with short quillons, attached to a rounded guard. Materials ranged from brass to iron, which was often covered with gold or silver. La Belle was a French vessel part of an expedition to the Gulf of Mexico. 100 soldiers were found aboard the vessel, and as can be attested by archaeological findings from the shipwreck, the small sword was their favorite melee weapon. However, just like the cutlass, there wasn't some advanced process behind their production. In spite of their fencing flair, small swords were mass-produced to fill the needs of the army. The rapier had largely been supplanted by the small sword in the 17th century, but remained popular with the Spanish and Portuguese. It has a longer and slightly thicker blade than the small sword, and the hilt was typically fashioned with a cup guard. The advantage of the rapier was its length, but once a target came within reach, it became a liability, not to mention its disadvantage in close confinements. It was really unfit for group combat aboard a ship, and some pirates chose to ridicule it. Bartholomew Sharp scorned him in his journal, writing how, "I bid him strike, so clapped him on board and entered some men. But I had no occasion to put myself to that trouble, for he had no arms to defend himself with, save only rapiers." After losing his blades in a shipwreck, Captain George Shelvocke exchanged a silver ladle for a dozen rapiers. It was better than nothing. Still, it would remain the chosen weapon of the Spanish Navy well into the 19th century. Around the 18th of December, 1718, a trio of sloops entered the town of Bath, the foremost carrying the decapitated head of Blackbeard on their bowsprit. According to legend, the captain sustained 5 shots and 20 cuts before a Highlander cut off his head in 2 strikes using a large blade called a broadsword. This was a heavy, double-edged sword, most often used from horseback. However, Scottish Highlanders used it on foot, often in conjunction with a small, leather shield called a targe. Many Highlanders were staunch Jacobites, supporters of the deposed Stuart dynasty, and often rose up in rebellion against the monarchy. There are several paintings depicting their engagements with the redcoats, wielding their distinguishable bonnets, tartan kilts, targes, and broadswords. Many pirates appear to have been Jacobites. Some may have been Highlanders. Scottish pirate John Gow was depicted as wearing Scottish-like garments, a targe, but not a broadsword, actually a cutlass. However, the broadsword was depicted in the hands of Henry Morgan and John Rackham. It is not known if any pirate ever used a targe. A pistol was deadlier, and you could use it as well as your sword to block the enemy's attacks. Targes also required considerable skill to use, as they didn't make the wielder impervious to enemy attacks, and could easily impair his vision if he lacked the knowledge on how to properly wield it. A broadsword was also documented in the hands of one James Griffin, a forced man under Captain Coughlin, and Coughlin's quartermaster also carried one. Captain John Phillips carried a silver-hilted broadsword, which was later given to John Fillmore, one of the mutineers that brought the pirate to justice. Aside from its long and heavy double-edged blade, the Scottish broadsword was most often furnished with a basket hilt, providing excellent protection to the hand. Due to its weight, it was usually worn in a belt slung across the chest, called a baldric. This implement is heavily associated with pirates, but it stopped being used for holding lighter blades like the cutlass or smallsword around the year 1670. Instead, lighter blades like the cutlass, hanger and smallsword would have been kept directly from the belt, inside of a scabbard. The scabbard could either be attached via a belt frog, which is a sort of leather tube attached to the belt via a hoop. Some scabbards had small rings for belt attachment. It was best to keep the blade opposite to your sword arm, for easier reach. These belts did not have to be wide at all, and could be pretty thin, without losing the ability of holding a cartridge box, pistol, and pouch for your belongings. This filibuster is a perfect example. He wears a thin belt right upon his hip bones, to which is attached a pouch, pistol, and scabbard. Note how the pistol handle points out and is kept next to his sword arm, both acting as a counterbalance to his sword and indicating that he wields it together with his cutlass. Whether worn from a belt or baldric, swords were best kept in a scabbard. You could just tuck them into a belt or sash, but it could damage them over time. Additionally, scabbards protected the blade from rusting, an absolute necessity on the water. On land, scabbards were usually made of metal, but wood or leather were preferable at sea. Again, moisture. Black leather was especially good, sometimes shagreen, like this very pretty example. Leather is also easier to keep oiled. Oil would serve both to protect the scabbard, the blade, and made it easier to draw. The tips of a scabbard were often furnished with a protective metal end, preferably brass, which is water resistant. It's a popular enough image to see pirates climbing aboard the enemy with knives or swords in their teeth. It's a good way to break them, especially if you got the scurvy. It would have been more practical and seems to have been more common to keep them in scabbards, but the Barbary corsairs appears to have bit down on their blades come some occasions. Additionally, blades were often furnished with a wrist lanyard or a sword knot, a piece of rope connecting the blade to its wielder's wrist. It was easy to knock a sword out of an opponent's hand. Over time, wrist lanyards became more frilled and fanciful, at least for the officers. The cutlass and smallsword were the most common swords you'd find at sea, with the odd appearance of a rapier or broadsword. On the even more seldom occasion, you might encounter something especially exotic, like the aforementioned scimitar. While saber was often used in the period as a synonym for any curved blade, the scimitar referred specifically to a longer, deeply curved sword with a four-pointed star-shaped quillon and a slightly curved grip, the hilt lacking an attached pommel or any form of guard. The weapon is of Eastern and ultimately Mongol descent, and was designed for making cleaving strikes on horseback. Its mounted effectiveness would lead European cavalry to adapt their own variant, the saber, which had the same blade but a protective guard. The issue with the scimitar is that it's ineffective at thrusting. The blade had to be thrusted in a hooked motion to strike effectively, and this blow is easier to parry and riposte by an opponent. Owing to its lack of utility and flexibility, it wasn't a popular weapon at sea, at least in terms of functionality. Scimitars were still highly regarded as a status symbol. Dutch Admiral Cornelis Tromp was depicted with a scimitar. It can now be found on the Dutch Rijksmuseum. It was also found in the hands of a Mohawk king who visited London in 1710. As for pirates, the hilt of a scimitar was found in the wreck of the pirate ship Speaker, and one documented in the possession of Charles Swan. He offered it as a gift for the Sultan of Mindanao. Note that whilst a few scimitars may have been produced by European specialists, they were primarily imported from Persia or the Ottoman Empire. Those of you who have played Assassin's Creed 4 are probably familiar with the pistol sword, which is a hanger or cutlass with a built-in pistol. This example dates to around 1660 and has the lock on the right side, the barrel on the left. The trigger can be found at the top of the guard. It's a cool weapon and all, but highly unlikely that it was available or frequently used. I feel like this video wouldn't be complete without the inclusion of the boomerang. William Dampier was a buccaneer and one of the first Europeans to visit Australia. There he met Aboriginals, who he described as wielding wooden swords. The sword, he went on, is a piece of wood shaped somewhat like a cutlass, most likely referring to the boomerang. He never saw them throw it, nor did he try it himself. So no, Dampier did not smoke weed, and he did not throw boomerangs. Outside of combat, the sword had few other uses for a pirate. There was a torture method in which victims were beaten with the flats of swords. If they so much as flinched, the edge could nip them. The method was as much psychological as physical. Cutlasses were also used in defacing religious iconography, knocking down crucifixes, mutilating the figures of saints by cutting off their heads, hands, feet. Owing to the elements and usage, swords needed maintenance. On naval and merchant ships, the weapons were secured in the gunner's locker, the ship's armory, located forward on the orlop deck. This was done in order to prevent mutiny. Marines were an exception, keeping their weapons racked in their berthing area. These weapons were bought and paid for by the ship's owners. Pirates and privateers had to buy their own weaponry. This was pretty much a requirement for joining a crew. While aboard, they usually kept them on their person, and when off duty, spent a lot of time maintaining their arms. Owing to the personal investment, pirates appear to have had a strong martial culture and a lot of pride in their weapons. Sword maintenance involved cleaning, scrubbing off rust, and oiling. Beeswax was generally used to protect metal from moisture. A lot of time must have been spent sharpening them. The blades would dull and chip from striking wood, bone, and coat buttons. When Lieutenant Maynard dueled against Blackbeard, his sword got stuck in the pirate's cartridge box. Such instances were no doubt common. In the wreck of Blackbeard's ship, archaeologists recovered a whetstone, a small rectangular stone, which the edge of a blade is pushed against to sharpen. Blackbeard's whetstone was made of sandstone, and shows considerable signs of usage. A heavy-duty version of the whetstone was the grindstone, a stone wheel mounted on a spindle and crank apparatus. The grindstone was continuously turned by the crank, and the edge of the blade sharpened against the spinning wheel. Again, such a device was discovered in the wreck of the Queen Anne's Revenge. Grindstones were also used by pirates as a torture device. You'd lay a victim's head against it and grind away. I'm far from an expert in sword fighting, so I'll only be able to provide some very basic principles in this regard. If you want to learn more, I'm sure there are better resources online or maybe in your area, but neither this video or channel concerns fencing. Which is kinda befitting, because melee drill did not become part of the sailors' everyday until the early 19th century. But I digress. Fencing with any weapon is ultimately about hitting without being hit, which can be achieved in two ways: controlling the adversary's blade while attacking, or striking in tempo with the adversary. For example, thrusting as they withdraw their arm. The cutlass could most effectively be used in two techniques: drawing and cleaving. Drawing involves the swordsman drawing his elbow towards the body as the cut is made. One of the most powerful variants was the cut vertically high to low, drawing the hand down and backwards. Sweeping cuts were also common, but they were easier to dodge and made the attacker vulnerable, unless armed with a shield or targe. Inexperienced swordsmen preferred to cleave, a strike which was incredibly effective at close range. The particular design of the individual cutlass could lend itself better to the swordsman, his technique, and skill level. More evenly balanced cutlasses were better for the experienced swordsman, as it allowed him to use more refined techniques. A point-heavy cutlass required less skill to use, as they did more inherent damage from cleaving. Of course, the ship's deck was no space for duels of honor. They were tight areas cluttered with cannons, masts, rigging, hatches, bodies, and slick with blood. Smaller vessels like barks and piraguas lacked decks altogether, and there are paintings of boarding combat occurring between rowboats. Neither did boarders attack alone, but in groups. There was no space for sophisticated blade or footwork, and nowhere to retreat. Boarding combat involved spontaneous pistol shots at close range, pummeling, punching, kicking, kneeing, and grappling. The latter was especially effective at such close distance, for preventing the enemy's blows, and it does appear in period illustrations of melee fights. All in all, Boarding combat was an absolute mess. May the worst man win. However, pirates often fought duels on land to settle personal grievances. Many of these were fought with swords. The most famous example occurred between filibuster captains Laurens de Graaf and Nicolaas van Hoorn. Just like your first time, it was over in a few seconds. The men exchanged insults, Van Hoorn drew his blade, de Graaf drew his sword into Van Hoorn's wrist and kicked him into the sand. He locked him up below deck, where the wound became infected. Van Hoorn died the next month. Melee drill did not become part of the regular sailor's routine until the late 18th or early 19th century. Individual captains might make personal investments to train his men, and this occurred among pirates and privateers. In the mid-18th century, privateer Commodore Walker held training sessions aboard his ship. The regular crewmen practiced with single sticks, whereas the officers used foils. Single sticks, also called cudgels, were flat-pointed wooden sticks, with their handle covered by a wicker basket, similar to the broadsword. Seamen, especially the English, were said to be proficient in their use, and skill in the single stick transferred well over to the cutlass. Foils were metal swords with blunt edges, and flattened or even rounded points. The aforementioned corsair and swordmaster, René du Guesclin, hired an assistant fencing master to help school his crew in swordplay. Something must have gone wrong, because René later found himself dueling the trainer in the streets. The only pirate known to have held swordplay practice aboard his ship was Richard Taylor, a former naval officer active in the Indian Ocean during the early 1720s. According to a prisoner, the pirates exercised continuously at target practice and scrimmaging with wooden sabers and rapiers. Outside of these examples, it is unknown how well trained pirates were at the art. Some have suggested that they had better training than the regular seamen, which could be the case, but it has also been argued that pirates were notoriously undisciplined and lazy. The topic of swords and fighting is immense, and the video could purely have been dedicated to the cutlass alone. I was unable to cover other melee weapons, but they will be tackled in 2 future episodes, one concerning regular melee weapons other than swords, like the pike, axe, and knife, and then a final episode touching on the, let's just say, weirder sort. There might be biscuits. Spoons? Until then, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'm curious to hear in the comments which pirate sword is your favorite, and which one you might have used. As usual, thank you to my generous supporters over on Patreon. Patreon supporters get early access to my videos and can watch them without ads. And if you want to interact with fellow pirate enthusiasts, check out the link to our Discord server in the video description. Cheerio!